Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Bai Xiaochun kept pushing his hand down onto his bag of holding as he sped along. Really, he had no other choice but to do that. Despite the lizard having been sealed and placed in his bag of holding, it seemed to be struggling to get out into the open, forcing Bai Xiaochun to add in cultivation base power to keep the bag closed. I need to find somewhere to hole up. The first thing he thought of was the damaged fan. However, after attempting to make contact, he found that the spiderweb was interfering. Perhaps he could try to forcibly make the teleportation happen, but he was worried something could go wrong, and he might come out on the other end missing an arm or a leg. An arm or a leg I could deal with, but what would happen if my head didn't get teleported through? The mere thought of that scene caused him to shiver. No. If I want to teleport out of here, I need to find a place where the fighting between the clone and the two emperors weakened the spiderweb enough to establish a solid connection. He didn't even pause to think about going to the actual exit. Blurring into motion, he began to search. The Vile Emperor Dynasty Celestials had no way of easily tracking Bai Xiaochun, but it was different with those from the Saint Emperor Dynasty. They had many options, especially Chen Su. Although he was not powerful in terms of battle prowess, when it came to augury arts, none of the other Celestials were his equal. In fact, it hardly took Chen Su any work to get a general direction. There, he said, his eyes flashing. Jiyu Tianjun immediately shot into motion, followed by Sima Yunhua and the others. None of them sent messages ahead. After all, they didn't trust Bai Xiaochun, and were worried that if they notified him ahead of time, he might be prepared, and make it harder for them to get the lizard. Although the Saint Emperor had said that everyone would get a reward as long as the clone was acquired, all of them knew that the rewards would differ in quality. Jiyu Tianjun was absolutely set on being the one to come out on top, and had even agreed to concede some of the rewards he would get to Chen Su and the others in order to achieve that goal. The four of them pushed forward at top speed for about an hour before Chen Su's eyes began to shine brightly. 5,000 kilometers up ahead, he said, pointing. Jiyu Tianjun's eyes shone with cold light as he quickly performed an incantation gesture, sending 7 beams of sword light streaking off in that very direction. They moved so quickly that they were almost invisible, piercing through those 5,000 kilometers to appear right on top of Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's face fell as he leapt backward by about 30 meters. Even as he did, 7 beams of light slashed through the spot he had just occupied, causing enormous booming sounds to echo out. If he hadn't acted any faster, although he probably wouldn't have been killed, he would definitely have been seriously injured. Jiyu Tianjun, he said through gritted teeth. Those 7 beams of sword light obviously contained the aura of Jiyu Tianjun. You're obviously trying to rob me. If you wanted all the credit, you could have messaged me and talked things over. But instead, you just try to outright rob me. Already, Bai Xiaochun was starting to get angry. Bai Xiaochun was very well aware that the Celestials of the Saint Emperor Dynasty were a sanctimonious lot. However, the possible benefits at hand today were enormous. Although the Saint Emperor had said that everyone would be rewarded, Bai Xiaochun was under no illusions that he, an outsider, would be treated fairly. And Jiyu Tianjun's actions had just gone to prove that. Complete and utter bullying. Gritting his teeth, he accelerated, heading to a location off in the distance where the spiderweb seemed particularly weak. Although he couldn't see Jiyu Tianjun and the others, he could tell that their divine sense was spreading out toward him. However, the 7 swords were faster than the divine sense, and had already circled back around to attack him again. After dodging them yet again, he continued on toward the weakened portion of the spiderweb. He knew that he would only have one shot at this, and that if he failed, the other Celestials would arrive, and he would be forced to hand over the lizard. Even with the Great Sword of the North, he couldn't fight all 4 of them at the same time. Furthermore, they could afford to rely on resurrection as their ultimate backup, whereas if he perished, he had no such option. Well, since they're pushing things this far, they can't blame me for cheating. I didn't want to do this earlier, but now I can do it with a clean conscience. Even as the 7 beams of sword light closed in, followed closely by Jiyu Tianjun and the other Celestials, he took a deep breath and made contact with the damaged fan. That single thought caused the air around him to blur and distort. In the blink of an eye, 7 swords slashed through the area, followed by streams of divine sense from the Celestials, a veritable windstorm of destructive power. Unfortunately, not a trace of Bai Xiaochun was anywhere to be seen. After a few breaths of time passed, 4 beams of light appeared off in the distance. The Celestials all had somber expressions on their faces, and as soon as they arrived, they sent their divine sense out as high and low and far as possible, looking for clues. Gu Tianjun sent his swords slicing through the air in the area, and Chen Su performed incantation gestures to try to get a read on Bai Xiaochun. And yet, to their utter disbelief, Bai Xiaochun was really nowhere to be seen. Impossible, Gu Tianjun said, his eyes crimson. Based on his connection to his flying swords earlier, he could say with absolute certainty that Bai Xiaochun had been present. But then, a moment later, he was gone. Furthermore, there were no signs of teleportations having been performed in the area. The other Celestials simply couldn't guess how Bai Xiaochun had possibly escaped. Face grim, Gu Tianjun waved his hand, transforming his 7 swords into 49 swords that slashed out in a furious tempest, kicking up dust as they cut everything to pieces. Sima Yunhua and Celestial Aged Spirit did everything they could think of as well, but it did no good. Eventually, the 3 of them looked over at Chen Su, whose eyes glowed with the light of augury. They waited, their hearts pounding as they realized that something seemed very strange about Chen Su. His forehead was covered with sweat, and he was even trembling visibly. Eventually, he opened his eyes and coughed up a massive mouthful of blood. Staggering backward, he weakened visibly, and roughly 30% of the hair on his head dissolved into ash. Deep wrinkles spread out on his face. Impossible, Chen Su murmured, hardly able to deal with the backlash from his failed augury attempt. Either an Archean is masking his presence, or he's not in the second immortal domain. Those are the only ways he could completely evade me. The other Celestial's jaws clenched in response to his words. As for Gu Tianjun, he gritted his teeth and said, he's got to be hiding somewhere. Let's split up and search. We have to find him. With that, he blurred into motion to begin searching. Sima Yunhua and the others similarly spread out. As the Celestials from the Vile Emperor dynasty locked down the exit, and the forces of the Saint Emperor dynasty began to search, Bai Xiaochun appeared on the damaged fan as it sailed through the darkness of the void. After quickly checking to make sure that all his limbs and extremities were with him, he breathed a sigh of relief, and then chuckled with pride. HMMMPHH. Think you can track me down here? Keep dreaming. Flicking his sleeve, he sat down cross-legged, slapped his bag of holding, and brought out the lizard. This lizard was actually a part of the fleshly body of a sovereign, and although it was virtually dead, it still had a scrap of life left in it. However, it was clearly beyond recovery, and was even starting to turn stiff with death. This thing isn't bad at all, Bai Xiaochun said, licking his lips with the realization that he had acquired something that would drive others mad with envy if they knew he had it. As the Celestials from both imperial dynasties were in the spider-web-covered second immortal domain, searching for Bai Xiaochun, he was on the damaged fan, excitedly examining the lizard laying in front of him. His initial detailed inspection had confirmed that the thing was on its last legs, and was no threat to him. But being the cautious individual that he was, he put quite a few restrictive spells on it anyway, just to be safe. Then he took out the Great Sword of the North and slashed at it a few dozen times. Although the lizard still wasn't completely dead, its aura was now so weak that I seemed like little more than a chunk of meat. Finally, he breathed a sigh of relief. It's always good to be extra safe. As far as he was concerned, his extraordinary caution was a very good thing, and it caused his eyes to shine with pride and anticipation. I felt a reaction earlier from my undying live forever technique, and now there's nobody around to interrupt me. I wonder if I can perfect the technique even more. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he took a deep breath, put his hand on the lizard, and then activated his undying live forever technique. It was almost like an immobile horse cart that had been shoved with great force. The technique immediately went to work, causing a gravitational force to spring up that grew stronger with every moment thanks to Bai Xiaochun's promptings. It happened suddenly, but he had been waiting for something like this to occur. Instead of keeping only one hand clamped down on the lizard, he reached out and pushed his other hand onto its head. His hands were like two vortexes, and he, a black hole. As for the lizard, it shivered and opened its eyes wide. It was even possible to hear it wheezing a bit. He wasn't sure exactly what he was absorbing from it, although he knew it wasn't life force. It was something in the thing's blood, something that other Celestials would not easily be able to extract, and even Archeans would have trouble with. Just as he had realized back in Merknine County, his undying live forever technique and this lizard had similar origins. Therefore, the process went very smoothly. Only a moment had passed, and yet the lizard was losing its color, turning darker, as if it were rotting away. And yet, it wasn't rotting. It was more like a mortal who, despite not being sick, was suddenly listless, as though some unknowable property within them was slowly vanishing. Bai Xiaochun could sense what was happening, and it caused his eyes to go wide. Although he didn't know exactly what his undying live forever technique was absorbing, he could tell that the technique was transforming. Rumbling sounds filled him as his blood, flesh, bones, energy passageways, and everything else that made him up began to change. Previously, it had seemed an impossibility to do anything with the technique after he had fully mastered it. But right now, his fleshly body power was actually rising. As the rumbling filled him, he shivered, feeling himself growing stronger, both in his fleshly body and in his divine abilities and magical techniques. However, what was being affected was specifically the undying codex aspect. The live forever codex remained the same. Even still, he was already going wild with joy. His fleshly body hadn't improved for a long time, and as for his time immemorial codex, it was only useful for the cultivation base. Right now, his fleshly body was improving rapidly. In fact, Bai Xiaochun could also tell that the most precious aspect of the undying codex, his powers of regeneration, were also transforming, becoming faster and stronger. Bai Xiaochun couldn't have been more excited. For some reason, he now felt as if his fleshly body and powers of regeneration had no limit. The contentment and pleasure he felt from this transformation process was something he had never before experienced with regards to his undying live forever technique. Much of his cultivation of the technique had been bitter and painful. The hunger and lack of life force he had dealt with had been uncomfortable, to say the least. One reason why few people had ever cultivated the undying live forever technique to completion was a lack of life force, and the other was the sheer pain involved. But now, things were different. It was as if this was the true undying live forever technique, and what Bai Xiaochun had cultivated was an imitation. As he reveled in the sensation, his fleshly body and powers of regeneration improved by 20%, 30%, 40%. He almost felt like his fleshly body progress might surpass his cultivation base and reach the Archean realm first. However, it was at this point that he realized that whatever substance he was absorbing from the lizard was rapidly diminishing, leaving the lizard almost completely emptied out. He looked over and confirmed that the lizard had lost all of its vitality, and the flame of its life force was going completely dark. Within moments, it would definitely be completely dead. As the process continued, it went completely stiff and unmoving. All of that unknown substance was now gone from within it. Stunned, Bai Xiaochun probed his undying live forever technique, and confirmed that it had improved by about 40 or 50%. Although it was still exciting, he felt a bit disappointed. Did absorbing that stuff kill it? Or did it stop because it died? After a long moment passed, he sighed. I can't believe that lizard claimed to be the clone of a sovereign. What a complete wimp. Muttering to himself, he checked his fleshly body, whereupon his mood improved a bit. Whatever, I guess I absorbed as much as I could. As of now, I'm the strongest person in the mid-celestial realm even without the greatsword of the north. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. There's no way this lizard, which came from the fleshly body of a sovereign, could possibly be so useless. There must be other valuable aspects to it. Chuckling, he looked back down at the thing, stroking his chin for a bit before pulling out the greatsword of the north. Backing it with all of his fleshly body power and cultivation base, he slashed it down toward one of the lizard's legs. It was dead, and stiff as a board, but Bai Xiaochun had just benefited from a massive power-up. Booms rang out, and although it took some work, a few dozen slashes to be specific, he managed to cut the leg off. There was no blood. Apparently, the lizard really had become nothing more than a dried-up corpse. Grabbing the leg, he studied it closely for quite some time. However, he couldn't find anything special about it. Whether it was divine sense or the naked eye, it seemed ordinary in every aspect. Not even using medicine concocting techniques on it did anything. He also went so far as to try a spirit enhancement, only to have no results. In the end, he was really starting to get frustrated. There's no way. Don't tell me that stuff I absorbed was what the Saint Emperor and Vile Emperor were hoping would contain the secret to getting to the sovereign realm? He scratched his head, thinking that, if the lizard were really of this little value, then everything that had gone on was really a waste. I took such a big risk, he thought. With that, he hacked the lizard up into a collection of smaller parts, which he then inspected even more closely, hoping to find something like an internal core. However, in the end, he found nothing. Looking down at the pile of body parts, he frowned. What kind of practical joke is this? Sighing, he collected up the pieces of the broken corpse and tried to figure out how he would explain it all after returning to the second immortal domain. However, it was at that point that something like a stiff wind rose up on the damaged fan. As that happened, the spirit automaton awoke. Heavens, what is that? The fleshly body of a sovereign? I recognize that aura. It's him. It's definitely him. There was even a bit of terror within the automaton's voice. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun's eyes went wide, and he shivered. Damn it, I got too excited and wasn't paying attention to the time. The spirit automaton is awake. He merged into that big tree last time. If he merges into this lizard, I'm dead. Even as he gasped in shock, he could sense the spirit automaton's divine sense rumbling toward him like ocean water. There was no time for planning or consideration. Although he had already chopped the lizard's corpse up limb from limb, he shouted at the top of his lungs, grabbed the great sword of the north, and vigorously began trying to chop it up into smaller pieces. As the spirit automaton's divine sense closed in, booms rang out as Bai Xiaochun turned the 7 or 8 pieces into something more like 13 or 14. No, the spirit automaton cried anxiously, but he wasn't quick enough. Just as Bai Xiaochun had suspected, the first thing the spirit automaton did was try to merge into the chunks of the lizard. The more than 12 pieces of the lizard suddenly formed back together, but only for a moment before collapsing again. Damn it, that's from a sovereign's fleshly body. Are you an idiot, Bai? Enraged, the spirit automaton tried again. Bai Xiaochun's heart was pounding, but when he realized that the spirit automaton was failing over and over again, he breathed a sigh of relief. The lizard had simply been chopped up into too many parts to be put back together. Feeling very pleased with himself, he laughed heartily. What the hell makes you think you can fight with Lord Bai, you little spirit automaton? Lord Bai can see through your simplistic thoughts with a single glance. Seeing the chunks of flesh trying to form together again, he stepped forward and kicked them apart. Grabbing a few chunks and throwing them into his bag of holding, he stood there and looked down at the remaining bits. Clearing his throat, he said, "All right, keep going, Bai Xiaochun." The spirit automaton howled, gritting his teeth and making another attempt. Glaring, Bai Xiaochun kicked the pieces apart again, and put a few more in his bag of holding. Damn it, this is outrageous, the spirit automaton raged. Go challenge the next level, Bai. I won't interfere, I promise. Get the hell away. Snorting coldly, Bai Xiaochun kicked at the pieces again and took a couple more. At this point, the spirit automaton felt like he was about to collapse. Let's talk this over, Bai Xiaochun. The spirit automaton wailed, seemingly on the verge of going mad. At the same time, he tried yet again to merge with the corpse. The fleshly body of a sovereign was simply too important, otherwise he would rather have died than negotiate with Bai Xiaochun. But before he could say anything else, Bai Xiaochun chuckled darkly and kicked the pieces again. The process repeated itself several times until there were only 2 chunks of flesh left. Yet again, the spirit automaton entered them and tried to combine them into one, whereupon Bai Xiaochun snorted and stepped forward. Are you done yet, Bai Xiaochun? The automaton wailed. Let's talk this over a bit, alright? Don't be like this. Listen to me, Yet again Bai Xiaochun kicked the pieces apart, then took one and put it into his bag of holding. Alright, keep going, little automaton. Bai Xiaochun couldn't have been more pleased with himself. Considering how much grief the spirit automaton had given him in all the levels in the past, this was definitely good revenge. He felt even better when he saw the spirit automaton struggling with the final chunk. Heaven damn you, Bai Xiaochun, the spirit automaton howled. When he saw that Bai Xiaochun was about to take the final piece, he simply couldn't take it. Give me this one piece. If you do, I'll tell you what's so special about it. The spirit automaton would obviously not say such a thing unless it were absolutely necessary. To have something like this dangled right in front of him, only to be unable to take it, made it feel like his heart was being crushed. In response to the spirit automaton's words, Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered. However, he didn't hold back from delivering a vicious kick. Snorting coldly, he said, "Who do you think you're fooling? That sovereign-level fleshly body was good stuff. I already absorbed all of it." Then he delivered another kick, backing it with his mid-celestial realm cultivation base, and all of the fleshly body power he could muster. It slammed into the chunk of flesh like an entire mountain, instantly shoving the spirit automaton out of it. When the spirit automaton saw Bai Xiaochun then grab the chunk of flesh and prepare to throw it into his bag of holding, he nearly started weeping. Forcing down his revulsion, he quickly said, "All you got was the quintessence of its flesh and blood. I'm talking about the cultivation base aura hidden within it. Sovereigns have incredible fleshly bodies and cultivation bases. That's the only way they can reach that incredible level. Listen to me. You must practice some special technique that allowed you to absorb its fleshly body quintessence. But the aura hidden inside it is something that, in all existence, only I can extract perfectly. Give me half of the fleshly body, and I can give you half of the aura." Worried that he would speak too slowly, he blurted everything out as quickly as possible. Even still, Bai Xiaochun looked suspicious. A few breaths of time passed, after which he sighed. Forget it, I don't trust you. Plus, half of it is too much. Shaking his head, he put away the final chunk of flesh, turned, and prepared to leave. The spirit automaton truly felt like he was going mad. He had told him the truth, and yet hadn't been believed. It seemed no amount of explanations would change that. Seeing that Bai Xiaochun was starting to fade away and would be gone, the spirit automaton shouted, "Give me 30%. 30% is enough. Damn it, just 3 pieces. 3 pieces is all I need. A single piece. Just give me one." The spirit automaton was sinking into the depths of despair. However, it was at this point that Bai Xiaochun suddenly faded back into clarity. Looking torn, he turned to the spirit automaton and asked, "A single piece will do?" "Yes." The spirit automaton replied through gritted teeth, although he tried to make it seem like he was happy with that. Bai Xiaochun blinked a few times and cleared his throat. The truth was they had been tempted from the beginning to accept, but had felt that the spirit automaton's demands were a bit excessive. As it turned out, the spirit automaton seemed very clever most of the time, but in critical moments, was actually quite foolish. Muttering to himself, he pulled out the chunk of flesh and threw it over. "First extract all of the sovereign aura from this part." "Wait, no, just 70% will be fine." After all, he still had to return and give the remains of the lizard over to the vile emperor and saint emperor. If he took too much from it, it could lead to some major problems later. To safeguard against the spirit automaton doing something underhanded, he gave him a very small chunk. That way, if he succeeded, all would be well, and he could go on to another piece. The spirit automaton was cursing inwardly, but had no other options at his disposal. To him, a single chunk of a sovereign's flesh and blood was an unprecedented level of good fortune. Brightening a bit, he used a secret magic to start extracting the aura from the flesh. It was impossible to see the sovereign aura, but as it spread out, it caused terrifying weight to press down in all directions. As soon as Bai Xiaochun sensed the incredible pressure, he shivered and began to pant. His cultivation base began to rotate of its own accord, almost as if he had just encountered some deadly situation. Thankfully, he had already absorbed the quintessence of the sovereign's flesh and blood, otherwise the pressure wouldn't have caused his cultivation base to rotate, but rather, would have suppressed it all the way to the limit. The truth was that there hadn't even been a bit of goodwill in the spirit automaton's offer. He had hoped to test out how much of the flesh and blood quintessence Bai Xiaochun had absorbed, and if he ended up being suppressed, he could have pressed an attack. When he saw that Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base was merely rotating rapidly, he sighed and dismissed the idea. Then, he watched helplessly as Bai Xiaochun prepared to absorb 70% of the cultivation base aura. The aura wasn't corporeal, but did take the shape of a black crystal, which Bai Xiaochun quickly grabbed out of the air. As soon as he touched it, his aura began to fluctuate wildly, and his cultivation base began to rotate with unprecedented speed. All of a sudden, he felt himself capable of thinking more clearly than ever, and capable of understanding things that had long been difficult for him to grasp. "This stuff is awesome," he exclaimed in delight. The spirit automaton remained off to the side, torn about the whole situation. He obviously wanted to stop what was happening, but the chunk of flesh Bai Xiaochun had given him was too small. And he was worried that if he got greedy, Bai Xiaochun would change the deal and not give him what he had promised. The spirit automaton briefly considered using the sovereign aura he had command over to try to threaten or extort Bai Xiaochun, but quickly abandoned the idea. Considering how much he knew of Bai Xiaochun's shameless and crafty nature, it seemed likely it would only be asking for trouble. "Damn it, I'll just cooperate this once. Sooner or later, I'll get my chance to destroy him." Gnashing his teeth, he watched as Bai Xiaochun delightedly looked at the crystal and the sovereign's flesh. Around the time the spirit automaton was starting to get impatient, Bai Xiaochun reluctantly put the crystal and the chunk of flesh away, then pulled out another small chunk and tossed it over. And thus, keeping careful control over the size of the chunks of flesh, he had the spirit automaton extract the aura from almost the entire corpse. In the end, he didn't go back on his word. He took the largest piece he had, which was about twice as big as the other pieces he had produced during the process, and tossed it to the spirit automaton. "Don't you dare say that Lord Bai is untrustworthy. I'm the most trustworthy person you know." The spirit automaton was cursing inwardly, but didn't let it show. He simply grabbed the chunk of flesh. He didn't extract the aura of this one like he had with the other pieces. Instead, he tried to fuse with it. This time, because Bai Xiaochun didn't interfere with the process, he succeeded in about the time it takes half an incense stick to burn. At that point, the chunk of flesh vanished, and the spirit automaton was no longer visible. Now he had a physical body. It was a strange body, being only a lump of skin the size of a watermelon, with some crude facial features. Overall, he looked quite strange. So that's what you look like, Bai Xiaochun said, looking at him closely. What are you looking at? The lump of skin said, glaring at him. What, I'm not allowed to look or something? Bai Xiaochun said, glaring back, fully confident in his skill in staring at people. Man, so ugly. Feeling provoked, the spirit automaton stared back for a long moment. However, as the pressure built, and he felt more and more uncomfortable, he mumbled some excuses and then hopped over toward the nearest fan rib and vanished. HMPH. Thinks he can win a staring contest with me? Yeah, right. Feeling quite proud of himself, he rubbed his bag of holding, marveling at how much he had profited. Although he hadn't experienced a massive windfall, the sovereign aura he did gain was enough to be happy about. I wonder what I'll be able to do with it, he thought, licking his lips. Glancing around to make sure he was alone, he pulled out one of the black crystals and sent some divine sense into it. Rumbling sounds filled his mind as both his cultivation base and thinking ability seemed to grow stronger. He felt unprecedentedly focused, with more control over his cultivation base and energy passageways than he had ever experienced. It was as if he could understand anything he set his mind to, and control everything about himself. The third level of the Time Immemorial Codex. His eyes shone with bright light as he realized that he could try to use the sovereign aura to make progress with the third level of the Time Immemorial Codex. One black crystal after another vanished. After absorbing about 30% of the total amount of the sovereign aura he opened his eyes. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he was sure of one thing: the sovereign aura was incredibly useful. Although he hadn't achieved the progress he wanted with his Time Immemorial Codex, he was more than halfway there. And it wasn't that he couldn't finish the work if he didn't want to. Rather, he had come to realize that there was something very unique about his Time Immemorial Codex. When he finished, it would become part of him, as if it were branded inside of him. He wouldn't even need to cultivate it at that point, it would automatically propagate itself. However, he needed to be at the late celestial realm for it to work. Otherwise, his body wouldn't be able to sustain the force. I need to stop and wait until I reach the late celestial realm. At this point, his eyes shone with anticipation. He was now completely and utterly confident that he would be able to finish the third level of the Time Immemorial Codex when the time was right. This sovereign aura is like a precious treasure. He looked down at the remaining black crystals, of which there were over a dozen. As of now, he was sure that these items were what the Vile Emperor and Saint Emperor wanted. What a pity that I have to leave 30% of the sovereign's flesh and blood behind. There must be 7 or 8 crystals worth of aura in there. Although it seemed like a bit of a waste, he knew that he couldn't do anything more. If he took the rest of the aura, he wouldn't be able to hand anything over to the Saint Emperor. What he planned to hand over was already missing 70% of its original aura, but Bai Xiaochun was the only one to have got his hands on the lizard, and therefore, no one but he knew exactly how much was there to begin with. Neither of the two emperors would have any idea, and in fact, it would take a lot of hard work and preparation on their part to even extract the aura that was left. Whatever. Forgetting any thoughts of taking the remaining 30%, he decided that he was done for now. Eyes flashing with determination, he began to fade away as he left the damaged fan. When he reappeared, he was back in the second immortal domain. 13 days had passed since he went missing. During that time, the Celestials from both imperial dynasties had been going crazy searching the area covered by the spiderweb. Even when they encountered certain dangerous situations, they had no choice but to keep up the search. They had looked high and low, but not found a single clue about where Bai Xiaochun was. The two emperors had continued to grow anxious, but had prevented each other from entering. The only thing they were sure about was that none of the Celestials under their command had been killed. However, they had no clue about what else was going on. As the mad search continued, Bai Xiaochun materialized in the exact same spot he had disappeared from. As soon as he appeared, he backed up cautiously, and sent divine sense out to check his surroundings. Unfortunately, it didn't matter how cautious he was. It was in almost the exact same instant that he appeared that an excited voice rang out. So, you came back here, Bai Xiaochun. Along with the voice came the projection of an enormous hand, which shot toward him. That hand belonged to none other than Celestial Aged Spirit. Unlike the other Celestials, Celestial Aged Spirit had had dealings with Bai Xiaochun. After Gu Tianjun and the others went out to search, Celestial Aged Spirit thought about the situation more, and came to the conclusion that something strange was going on. As such, he had decided to wait in the spot that Bai Xiaochun had disappeared from, to keep watch. On many occasions during the past 13 days, he had questioned that decision, but now that he saw Bai Xiaochun materializing in front of his very eyes, he went wild with joy. He also attacked immediately. However, he was the cautious type, and knew that Bai Xiaochun was in the mid-celestial realm, and possessed his great sword of the north, which would make it difficult to defeat him quickly. Therefore, he also pulled out a transmission jade slip to send a message to his fellows. When Bai Xiaochun saw that, he quickly said, "Fellow Taoist aged spirit. Shish." Then, he pulled out a chunk of the sovereign's flesh and tossed it over to him. Bai Xiaochun took action so quickly that celestial aged spirit didn't have time to send his message. Before he could do anything, he saw a head-sized chunk of flesh sailing toward him through the air. Stunned, he sent some divine sense out, and when he realized that it was a chunk of sovereign-level flesh, his heart began to race. Abandoning his idea of sending any messages, he grabbed the flesh and looked it over. Doing his best to suppress his excitement, he put it away and then looked over at Bai Xiaochun, a strange expression on his face. "I seem to remember you getting your hands on the entire lizard," he said in an odd tone. Considering the state of the chunk of flesh he had been given, he could guess at some of the punishment Bai Xiaochun had inflicted on the lizard. Clearing his throat, Bai Xiaochun said, "You really have sharp eyes, aged spirit old pal. Here, take 3 more pieces." With that, he took out 3 more pieces and tossed them over. Stunned, celestial aged spirit quickly caught the 3 pieces and looked them over too. Based on his calculations, together with the first piece, they made up something like 20 to 30% of the entire lizard. "Look, we're all on the same team," Bai Xiaochun said, sounding very grand and righteous. "What's the point in bickering with each other? Am I right? From what I remember, the Saint Emperor said we just had to find the thing, and we would all be rewarded. This is all just a misunderstanding. You guys never gave me a chance to explain the situation. Right now, all of us Saint Emperor Dynasty Celestials can get our hands on some good fortune. It's not a meritorious service performed by me alone, and therefore, I absolutely have to share the rewards. I'm not the greedy type, you know. Just now, aged spirit old pal, I gave you an entire leg of that big lizard." Celestial aged spirit cleared his throat. Based on what he could tell, the flesh he had really did seem to be from a leg. Considering that, it really was a situation of sharing in the meritorious service. Seeing the excited look in aged spirit's eyes, Bai Xiaochun cautioned, "And so, we really can't let the Saint Emperor down. You take good care of that flesh. That's the most important thing. Actually, I've thought everything through already. That was a really bad misunderstanding before, so I think the best thing would be to call Gu Tianjun and the other Celestials over. I'll share some of the flesh with all of them, and then we can all get out of this place together. In the end, we'll all share equally in performing our meritorious service." Aged Spirit looked at Bai Xiaochun and could already tell what he was thinking. And it was true that the situation had dragged on for too long. Even Aged Spirit had reached the limits of his patience. Nodding, he proceeded to send messages via Jade Slip to Gu Tianjun and the others. Both Bai Xiaochun and Celestial Aged Spirit knew that standing around waiting was too dangerous, so they found a village that hadn't been reduced to dust and hid inside one of the buildings there. Chen Su was the first to arrive. After looking around carefully, he followed the trail left by Celestial Aged Spirit's divine sense into the village. Before long, he was there in the room with Bai Xiaochun. Before he could say anything, Bai Xiaochun grandiosely handed over a chunk of one of the lizard's other legs. "Chen, old pal, here. Take this. I was a big dunce earlier. Although, I have to point out that you guys were a bit impulsive. After all, I would never take all the credit for myself in a venture like this." Chen Su reacted much the way Celestial Aged Spirit had, and a strange expression appeared on his face. He had already been informed of the general situation before coming, but even still, felt it to be odd. "And here are 3 more pieces, old pal." Smiling sincerely, he handed over 3 more chunks. Of course, Chen Su gasped in much the same way Celestial Aged Spirit had earlier. He looked at Bai Xiaochun, then at the mysterious chunks of flesh. Because much of the sovereign aura had already been extracted by the spirit automaton, they were much weaker than before, and yet, no one knew that. Chen Su looked at the pieces and, just as Bai Xiaochun had already determined, realized that they were enough for him. When Bai Xiaochun saw that both Chen Su and Aged Spirit had been pacified, he breathed an inward sigh of relief. At the same time, he was very pleased that his strategy was working. Sima Yunhua shouldn't be a problem, he thought. But I bet Gu Tianjun isn't going to be easy to please. Although I've already figured out the best way to divide the chunks of flesh up into 5 portions. Eyes glittering, he began to chat with Chen Su and Aged Spirit. None of them really had any bad blood between them, and they were all celestials. Furthermore, both Chen Su and Aged Spirit were naturally pleased that Bai Xiaochun had taken the initiative to split things up with them. Before long, they were having a truly entertaining conversation. Slowly but surely, their opinions of Bai Xiaochun were changing. Before long, whistling sounds could be heard off in the distance, and the three turned to find Jiyu Tianjun and Sima Yunhua approaching. As soon as Jiyu Tianjun saw Bai Xiaochun, killing intent flared in his eyes, and he prepared to attack. But before he could, Bai Xiaochun took out his trump card, tossing a huge pile of sovereign flesh over to him. Even the powerful Jiyu Tianjun was visibly moved by the sight of all that flesh, and by the intense aura emanating off of it. Waving his sleeve, he caught the chunks and put them into his bag of holding. There's no way you're not moved, Bai Xiaochun thought, feeling very pleased with himself. He had made some special preparations with the chunks of flesh he had given to Jiyu Tianjun, ensuring that their sovereign aura was particularly strong. And the effect was even greater when they were lumped together. Backing up a few steps, he tossed some chunks of flesh to Sima Yunhua and then said, "Listen everyone, the most important thing now is that we get out of here safely. Now that I've split that lizard up into 5 parts, we're all in this together." As his voice echoed back and forth in the room, Sima Yunhua took the chunks of flesh and examined them closely, eyes glittering. As for Jiyu Tianjun, his brows were slightly furrowed. Although he obviously coveted the full rewards, now that everyone had an equal share of the flesh of the lizard, he obviously couldn't demand them for himself. And what Bai Xiaochun had just said made sense. The most important thing wasn't getting a larger reward, it was making sure that the vile Emperor Dynasty Celestials didn't rob them. If Jiyu Tianjun obstinately tried to pick a fight with Bai Xiaochun now, it was likely that the other 3 Celestials would interfere. And at this point, infighting could be detrimental to them all. Upon realizing all of these things, Jiyu Tianjun's eyes narrowed, and he looked at Bai Xiaochun for a long moment. He had to admit that Bai Xiaochun's methods were very effective. Finally, he snorted coldly and stepped back, making it clear that he was backing down. At that point, Aged Spirit, Chen Su and Sima Yunhua all breathed sighs of relief. Just as Jiyu Tianjun had suspected, if he had chosen to press the issue, the 3 of them would have opposed him. At this point, a short conversation occurred. "From what I understand, all of the people from the vile Emperor Dynasty are split up as they search for fellow Taoist Bai. That means we need to stick together. Let's get to the exit as quickly as possible, and not stop along the way." "That's right. Let's catch them off guard, and get out of here before they can regroup. There's no time to lose." Off to the side, Jiyu Tianjun nodded. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was the least concerned of all, and quickly agreed. After planning things out, the 5 of them drew upon the full power of their cultivation bases to start moving as quickly as possible. Rumbling sounds echoed out as they pierced through the air toward the exit. Making such a visible break for the exit was obviously going to attract attention. But they didn't care. They didn't even bother to hide the fluctuations caused by their passage. As they moved along, it became apparent who among them was moving faster than the others. Jiyu Tianjun was in the lead, followed by Celestial Aged Spirit and Bai Xiaochun, with Chen Su and Sima Yunhua taking up the rear. As they neared the exit, they saw 3 streaks of light moving in their direction. They were none other than Prince Demon, Reverend Devourer and Gongsun Wan'er. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.